Okay, hello. Um, so before I start talking about the reading for this time, I just wanted to say something about the reading for next time. First of all, it's not from the book, it's on Canvas, so I hope everyone can find that. By the way, someone was complaining that this book was not on reserve, that only the German version was on reserve or something like that. But it didn't look way to me when I went to the library. It's unreserved. Okay. Something must have confused them. Okay. Don't have them. I had to get them shipped to Germany here in LA. Oh, they didn't even have a German version here. Okay. So it definitely wasn't that. All right. I don't know what happened. Um, so yeah, so first of all, that reading is on Canvas. It's right, it's three papers. It's a later paper by Carnap, and then a response to that by Otto Neurath, and then a response to Neurath by Carnap. Um, and I mean, I guess there's two main points to it. One is like how the verificationist thesis starts to change, right? So you'll see a loosened version of it if you pay attention compared to in the Aufbau. And the other obviously is the difference between Carnap and Neurath's approaches. They're both members of the Vienna Circle. They see themselves as collaborators, but they clearly disagree about some important things, both about science and about politics, kind of mixed together. So anyway, you'll see that. And the only other thing I wanted to say about the reading for next time, I think I already alluded to this, but the meaning of this word protocol, right? Because this exchange between Carnap and Neurath is part of the so-called protocol sentences debate. So it's about like what the protocol sentences are. And I just, protocol is, we don't usually use protocol to mean this in English. Um, it means, it means like a notebook you write things down in. So like, uh, observations in a lab, I think that's what they're mostly thinking about, or also like minutes at a meeting. That's why the famous or infamous protocols of the elders of Zion, which were supposed to be like the minutes of their meetings. Right. So that's just to explain what this means. Protocol sentences are the sentences the observer would write down in their protocol. And Carnap already used that. If you paid attention, he already used that in the Aufbau. He talked about the fictitious subject A making a protocol of all his experiences. Okay, that's all about the reading for next time. Now, the reading for this time. Okay, so what we're left with, I think, is the first question I wrote up when I began to discuss the book, which is what's up with this book? Um, And what do I mean by that? Well, Carnap says a lot of things in this book, even just in the parts I assigned. He says a lot of different things, and they don't all seem important to a single topic. Um, in fact, to some extent, they actually conflict with each other. I mean, not necessarily in that they're inconsistent, although sometimes there are things that seem inconsistent, but it just in the sense that they seem to be said from different points of view or um, like I said, it's not clear that there's one project that they're all really important to. Um, and therefore, to make sense out of the book, we have to figure out what in it is really important to Carnap and what in it are asides or examples or, something like that. Um, so, um, so I've I've already kind of prepared for like what I think is the right answer as I'm going along, but still I'm gonna go back and talk about different ways you could understand the book. Um, so, I mean, you might think the main point of the book was idealist and or nominalist. I guess maybe idealist and nominalist like Berkeley, right? So that, what really exists are individual elementar Erlebnisse, and everything else is uh, a fiction or a way of interpreting those things, right? Like, I mean, you can definitely see things in the book that sound like this. Like everything else besides the Elementar Erlebnisse are just abbreviations for they're just signs we've introduced to stand for things you could say about the Elementar Erlebnisse, right? That actually would be very much like Berkeley. Um, and there are things, even some things I didn't assign in the book that sound even more like this. Like in section 162, there's a whole parable about stars versus constellations. Um, so section 162 is about mind-body dualism. And in the little like remark paragraph, the kind that's like set in smaller type here. Uh, Let us illustrate this fact through an analogy. We observe the starred sky at night. Neither the moon nor clouds are visible, only stars. We can undertake to distinguish and classify the stars. Oh, sorry. So uh, this is all the case he's not going to describe, right? When he says the stars have different like brightness and color or whatever. In contrast, let us now consider the fictitious case that only fixed stars of equal brightness and color are visible. If we are now asked for the number of object types, we would have to answer that we notice objects of only one type. We would not become doubtful about the justification of this answer if someone were to object, no, there are quite a number of different object types that could be noticed. To begin with, the stars themselves. Secondly, the distances between any two stars. Third, the relations in size between any two distances. Fourth, the triangles of any three stars, etc., etc. I said stars versus constellations. That's just kind of a summary of all the other things you can say about the stars, right? So uh, he's saying there, we would say, no, we only see one type of object here. It doesn't seem relative. It seems like really is just one type of object here, and all the others are just a summary, a way of talking about that one object. Um, uh, and there's something that sounds like this also in section 167 when he talks about the anger of Zeus. So this was part of the assigned reading. Um, um, to pose the psychophysical problem from the vantage point of the heteropsychological. So, right, so that means something like asking why other people's brain processes are parallel to their mental processes, right? Like I'm asking, why is it? Like, give an explanation why uh, whenever uh, another person gets angry, a certain thing happens in their brain, as I know through my brain mirror, right? Which we don't really have what he describes here, but we have something a lot more like that than they had then. Anyway, so to pose the psychophysical problem from the vantage point of the heteropsychological would be very much like the following. Somebody has accustomed himself to envisage an angry Zeus whenever he hears thunder. Eventually, he poses the question of how it could be explained that Zeus's anger and the thunder always occur simultaneously, right? So, like, I mean, there's kind of two levels at which this parable can be taken, right? Like the simple point is that I've just defined Zeus's anger in terms of thunder, and so of course, by definition, whenever there's thunder, Zeus will be angry. And I mean, that's already kind of right. So that means, I guess, um, well, I haven't defined other people being angry in terms of their brain state, but I've defined it in terms of their behavior and their expression, which is causally connected to their brain state, right? So, um, so I shouldn't be surprised. There's nothing surprising about the fact that um, something physical always happens when they're angry because I've defined them being angry as a physical process, basically. That is, I've defined them being angry as something like the class of physical processes that are like this or something like that, right? I mean, it's a different constructional level, but it's still like there's an eliminative definition. I can get rid of all talk about them being angry in terms of talk about what they're doing. And of course, there's nothing surprising that what someone's body does is correlated with what happens in their brain. So, so that's one level. But moreover, it seems like the example of envisioning an angry Zeus, like that's mythology, right? Like the right way to think about it would be that there's thunder. The angry Zeus is kind of um, it's kind of a at best somewhat misleading story I've tacked on to the fact that there's thunder. Um, so, from passages like that, um, and so by the way, that's not the interesting psychophysical problem, according to Carnap, right? He's describing here why the real problem that is somewhat surprising is why there's a correlation between my mental states and my brain states. Um, but uh, but I don't think, that's neither here nor there as far as what this sounds like it's saying about an upper constructional level. It sounds like it's saying that it's a mythological construal of what's really going on the lower level. Um, so, like, I mean, if that were really the point of the book, then the most important things would be number one, the choice of basis, right? Because that would be Carnap telling you what he really thinks there is. Um, so you'd have to spend a lot of time thinking, like, what are these elementar Erlebnisse? Are they really so fundamental as Carnap thinks? How do we, et cetera, et cetera. Second of all, what would really be important would be the ascension forms. In particular, the fact that the ascension forms are eliminative definition, right? So that meaning that you get from one level to the next by means that the next level is kind of a shorthand for things you could have said at the previous level without it. Um, and then, there's a particular way of making that happen, but that would be the important thing because, of course, otherwise, the idealist or nominalist point wouldn't be proved, right? I mean, like we aren't showing that it's just like if uh, if some of the things I say about Zeus's anger like aren't equivalent to anything I could say about the weather, then whether I'm right or wrong about Zeus's anger, it's not just a shorthand way of talking about the weather. So that would be very important. And I guess the last thing that would be important is that, so if, I mean, these are the wrong things that are important, right? I'm building up the case for this, but I'm going to turn against it, right? But if you thought this was the point of the book, then the first thing that would be important is the choice of basis. And the second thing that would be important would be ascension forms. That these really are, definition. And this is the same as verificationism, basically. If these are really definitions, and assuming there's only a finite number of these. Now, actually, I realized that at one point in this reading, he actually says explicitly that it's a finite number. That causes all kinds of problems. I mean, it does seem to be what he's thinking, and it solves some problems, but it causes all kinds of other problems. Like, for example, if we say we want the point of view to change continuously as time goes on, well, like a finite set of points is never continuous. A finite set of points in a real coordinate space can't be continuous, right? So, it's related to the problem that Nelson Goodman finds with the early stages of the system. Um, Again, not in the thing by Nelson Goodman we're going to read, but in another thing. But okay, so and these two would go together with what I keep emphasizing that Carnap really doesn't want to do, namely policing science, right? Because if you now we would say, like, we know what things there really are. We know how to say every possible thing you can want to say about them. We want to make sure that the things that science says are, within that. So if there's something that like can't be reduced to the basis this way, that means that thing somehow scientists got confused and started spouting nonsense or something like that. And I mean, as I said, I'm gonna turn against this. So this is especially people who just came in. This is the idea that the main point of the book is idealism and or nominalism. Right? Idealism in this context means thinking that what really exists is my own ideas. I guess it would be a solipsistic idealism, right? Berkeley actually has other spirits ideas, sort of. But anyway, this is of course on Berkeley. And right, nominalism in this context would mean that only these individuals exist and not like higher set theoretic constructions. Uh, so so I don't think this is really the point of the book. I mean, I think that should be clear from what I said about it already. But I think there probably is something to it historically speaking, in the sense that at some stage in thinking about this, Carnap was attracted to something like this. Um, um, like before his work on the Aufbau or in his work in very early outlines of it, he was still maybe thinking something like this. And that may partly help to explain why there's some passages that sound like it. I mean, I don't want to put too much emphasis on that, but this is what, in the context of Kant, is called the patchwork theory, right? That people have the patchwork theory of the critique of pure reason. It's Kant wrote it over a period of 10 years and he changed his mind about everything, but he didn't go back and like actually change the earlier stuff. He just kind of like glommed it all together into a book. And that's why it's so hard to understand. Well, I mean, if that were really true, like to that extreme of any book, it wouldn't be worth reading, right? Like, what would be the point of trying to understand it if that's how it was written? Um, uh, and I mean, I don't think that this book is that extreme by any means, but there may be some things that sound kind of like this, partly because Carnap at some point did think that way. Um, right, but I mean, so to show why this is wrong, I can just go back and make points I've made about all these individual things before. That first of all, Carnap should have written choice of basis. Maybe I should make another of this. Like wrong because first of all, Carnap's as in the book as we have it says the choice of basis is relative to your purpose. Um, for our purposes, we want to choose a basis that's epistemically primary. And once we make that choice, the objects are going to be things that are epistemically primary, and everything else is going to be a quasi-object. Um, but Carnap says when he first discusses how to choose a basis, and then again on numerous times, he says, but for other purposes, you might want to choose a different basis. For example, and I mean, there's two alternate bases that he seems to think are very attractive. One is a psychological basis. So, right, this leads that the epistemically primary, the epistemic priority system, sorry, the system ordered by epistemic priority results in an auto-psychological basis. The basis is going to be my experiences. Like, who am I? I guess whoever is constructing the system. I mean, it actually, like, it doesn't really matter, actually. This is, I mean, this is true in Descartes too, I think, and everyone who thinks this way. This kind of like I voice is actually as public as you can get because it's like anyone who reads it is supposed to put themselves in the place of the I. It's not really Carnap talking to himself about his own experience, right? Like there's nothing in this book about Carnap's experiences. That's not, oh, it wouldn't be in place. Um, I think the truth is it's not really in place in the meditations either. But anyway, sorry, getting back to Carnap. So, right, so but he says, but for other purposes, you might want to choose a psychological basis. So a psychological basis means I take things that are epistemically, well, actually, maybe not even things that are epistemically primary, but anyway, some kind of mental entities, but not just mine, but everyone's. Now, I mean, obviously, that's going to make a lot of the later developments in the system a lot easier if you do that. That might be one reason to do it, right? Like if you have everyone's experience as a table to start out with, it's going to be much easier. Or like if if you wanted to solve the inverse Minecraft rendering problem that I was talking about last time, if you saw that lecture, um, if you had a whole bunch of players screens recorded, it would be much easier. There would be much more constraints to begin with on solving the problem because you would know what things look like from all kinds of different points of view. So, that would be one other choice. And another choice that Carnap is particularly attracted to, and as we'll see in a slightly later period, actually chooses instead of the autopsychological basis, is a physical basis where the basic objects would be something like elementary particles or field strengths at locations or something like that. And the basic relations would be distance relations between particles or, that type of stuff. And yeah, Carnap says, even at this stage, he says, for some purposes of like showing the unity of science, that would be a much better basis because the objects that you're talking about are publicly accessible and so on and so forth. So like if you chose one of those other bases, like suppose you chose the physical basis, then your basic objects, then the objects are particles. and everything else is a quasi-object. So in particular, like my experiences will come out quasi-objects, right? Because in this system with a physical basis, um, we're going to start with particles and fields. We're going to build up, more complicated physical objects until we get to my body. And then on the basis of the behavior of my body or the states of my brain or whatever, we're gonna construct my elementary experiences. And of course, in this system, there isn't going to be a difference between me and everyone else, right? Everyone's body is going to be at the same level, and we're going to construct psychological objects. These little lines here are the experiences. I guess the point is the physical objects end here, the psychological objects start with these experiences. Right, and these experiences are going to be constructed based on the way everyone's body behaves. Right, so whereas like in the Aufbau system, where we have autopsychological and then physical, you might say my experiences are the thunder and physical objects are the angry Zeus. Right, so every time I have certain experiences, I tend to think there's a table, and I shouldn't be surprised that tables come exactly when I have those experiences, um, because it's just the angry, right? But in this system, it's the other way around. The particles and fields and whatever are the thunder, and these psychological states are the angry Zeus. And the fact that Carnap thinks you should choose this system for some purposes and this system for other purposes shows that, I mean, as he says, right? Like, I mean, he emphasizes this actually, but that you shouldn't regard this distinction between object and quasi-object as a distinction between things that really exist and things that don't really exist. It's a logical distinction that's relative to a choice of system, and it just says where you're going to slot objects of certain types into your system. And I think if you ask, like, what makes these the same? Like, what do you mean where I'm going to slot physical objects into my system? You know, constructionally speaking, these are completely different objects than these. The definition is completely different, whatever. But I think we have to remember that all of these systems are going to be tested against our ordinary and scientific knowledge. They have to reconstruct it. So if I go around saying there's electrons going through the cloud chamber, I'm feeling kind of sad today and stuff like that, all those sentences have to be, I have to be able to translate them into my constructional system. If there's some that I can't translate, the constructional system is no good. So when I say, like, you could put physical objects here or you could put them here, I mean, you could take those sentences that we ordinarily say about physical objects and translate them into this part of a constructional system, or you could take them and translate them into this part of the constructional system. What we're doing here is moving from one language to another language, which is supposed to replace it. I mean, not supposed to replace it in practice. That's going to be one of the issues between Carnap and Neurath, actually. Right? Carnap doesn't think we're going to go around starting to speak the constructional language. But it's going to replace it in principle. It's going to be suitable as a replacement for it. And um, and we're choosing what language to make that transition to from the one that we already have. So we're already speaking this language. We're choosing a new language that we're going to at least like will to translate our old language into. We're intending it our old language to be translatable into this new language. We can choose this one or we can choose this one. If we choose this one, the things we used to call physical objects, will be first, and the particles and whatever goes down the bottom level will be objects, and everything else will be quasi-objects. But if we choose this one, it'll be the other way around. Did you have a question?
No,
No, you were
sorry.
just doing that. Okay.
Sorry.
That's fine. Um, right. So actually, like I've already said, the answer to this. What we're doing here is rational reconstruction. Carnap, says, look, we already know how to tell something's a table and say true things about it, or say things about it and figure out whether they're true, or collect evidence for whether they're true or not. Right? It's not like he has to teach us that. We already know how to talk about tables, for example. So, how do we actually recognize them? Well, who knows? It's really complicated, actually, right? I mean, the truth is, I think we now know, but this would be wrong to attribute to Carnap. I think people in this period didn't suspect this. Well, some did. William James suspected this, I guess, but most people didn't. I think the truth is we now know that like the way we recognize something like a table is probably kind of random in the sense that it's like there's like weights that are adjusted inside our neural connections, and it's just like whatever pattern got me to say table in the same times that other people got me to say table, if that works. Right? That's selected for. Um, and so, like, if you looked inside my brain, you wouldn't see a list of rules for telling whether something's a table or not. Right? Any more than, and the reason I say I think we know this now, although what I'm saying is really controversial, but this is what I think, that now that we see how AI is actually able to do these things, right? Like they spent decades trying to give it rules, how to tell whether something's a table, and there's an exception, and there's this exception, there's that exception, and it still couldn't do it, basically. This thing that's so easy for us. And then they just said, well, let's stop telling it rules and just try to get it to somehow produce table the right after the right pictures. And that worked great. So to me, that means that's probably what we're doing too, right? So anyway, um, so probably there is nothing like this going on in my mind at all, like with indicators and whatever. But Carnap says, nevertheless, like my behavior and discourse are rational because in principle you could give rules. Again, he probably underestimates, just as everyone underestimated when they started working on AI the old way, how difficult it would be to state those rules. But I don't think that means there aren't rules. Right? I think Carnap is probably right. In some sense, there must be. Um, so, but okay, so leaving all that stuff about AI aside, I mean, that's really important, but like I said, it's not something Carnap knows about, so it's out of place historically. I mean, it's one of the things that's important is it's out of place historically. Wait, did I say this in this class? There's certain stories I like to tell over and over, and then I get worried that I'm telling them in the same class over and over. The story, the story about early computer scientists that so apparently the people who worked actually I tracked down the real source for this, but now I've forgotten again. There's some particular person who said this actually, but basically the early people who worked on the early big vacuum tube computers were like really surprised to discover bugs. Like they thought you would tell the computer what to do and it would do it. They didn't realize how really hard it is to tell the computer what to do. Hey, that was that's like something we've discovered, basically, about how hard it is to give rules for doing something. Um, okay, but anyway, so getting back to Carnap, the point is what he's saying is, yeah, somehow or other, we already recognize tables and electrons. Um, Botanists, when they see a tree, don't go through a list of like usually don't go through a list of like characteristics. What do the leaves look like? What are, botanists, when they see a tree, go, oh, a pine tree. Right? So, and yet Carnap is saying that the important thing about what the botanist says is that they're responsible. If you ask them, how do you know it's a pine tree? They can tell you. Meaning they can tell you what really happened in their head. No, that's not really relevant. This is important because this is going to be one of the issues between Carnap and Quine. From Carnap's point of view, no, that's not really relevant. They probably can't tell you what actually happened in their head. Right? That's what Carnap calls intuition. This is a weird use of the word intuition. Well, not as weird as the way it's usually used now, but still pretty weird. Right? Carnap says intuition means we know, I'm able to recognize it, but I can't tell you how I recognize it. I just recognize it. So, the botanist can't tell you how they recognize the pine tree. That's intuition. But if you say, is that really a pine tree? How can you tell? Then they can start to give you characteristics. And Carnap says, at least in principle, they can give you necessary and sufficient characteristics. So every tree that's like that is going to be a pine tree, and only trees that are like that are going to be pine trees. This is a little bit, when it comes to biological species, this is actually a little bit fishy. This is not really how we define biological species now. Like there's actually a type specimen, and the members of the species are everything that are, you know, would naturally reproduce with something like that type specimen. Not with the type specimen itself, because that's dead and dried up and in a drawer somewhere. so, so anyway, but never mind. I mean, I think it's true that, however, that botanists do also have indicators. They don't actually, like every time, try to find something just like that type specimen and get it to reproduce with the pine tree, right? They actually, yeah, they have ways that you can tell what species it is. So that's a rational reconstruction. And Carnap says, I'm doing the same thing, only with the whole body of our everyday and scientific knowledge. Or at least I'm sketching the way you could possibly do that with the whole body of our everyday and scientific knowledge. And that means, as I've emphasized over and over, that you can't be policing our everyday and scientific knowledge because that's your data. I mean, you could, um, weird, I'm getting out of order because I don't see this written here in my notes. But oh well, I'm going to say it anyway. I mean, you could be saying something that's going to kind of correct science. I mean, I guess you could sometimes be suggesting, hey, you don't need this many indicators. This is enough, right? Or these indicators would be easier to use or something like that. Not that Carnap discusses anything like that. I'm just trying to imagine how this could be used, how you could bring this back to scientists and say, this will help you. By the way, it's not at all clear that philosophy of science is meant to help scientists at all. Right? In fact, Richard Feynman, the famous physicist, famously said that philosophy of science is useful to scientists in the way ornithology is useful to birds. Which, depending on understand that means either it's not useful at all, or maybe it's useful like for people who want to preserve science, right? Or understand science. It's useful, there might be benefits of that to scientists, but scientists shouldn't think about philosophy as science any more than birds, before they go to mate should be like reading ornithology textbooks. Right? So, um, but anyway, that's one way it might be helpful to science. Um, Another way, it kind of corrects science, but this is not a way that's helpful to scientists. And I think Carnap acknowledges this straight out, that it's not helpful to scientists, that you're suggesting a different way that scientific statements could be expressed, like a different language that could be used to express them. So the way that the scientists actually express themselves is what Carnap calls the realistic language, right? So they say there is a table there, right? Like the usual way we describe things. But Carnap says, this is where I wish I was at the right point in my notes because I wrote down the quote somewhere. Oh, here we go. It's in section 178 on page 287. Yeah. Oh, it's to the very end of the book, of course. The realistic orientation of the physicist shows itself primarily in the use of realistic language. This is right after Carnap said it's that sometimes people say, maybe I should start, it is occasionally said that there is a usually tacit realism at the bottom of the practical procedures of the empirical sciences, especially of physics. This is still usually said. Right? Like Carnap didn't manage to convince people, or didn't manage to convince them for long, that this was not true. That science commits you to realism, because scientists say things like there is a positron going through this cloud chamber. So they said there is one, so they believe in it, right? So they're realists. So Carnap says the realistic orientation of the physicist shows itself primarily in the use of realistic language. This is practical and justifiable, right? So Carnap is saying, yeah, for the purpose of physics, you shouldn't use the official language of the constructional system or the language of fictitious constructional operations, right? So the physicist shouldn't say, if a fictitious subject A wants to introduce the term positron, this is what they should do with their experiences. The physicist just says there's a positron in the cloud chamber, right? So Carnap says, yeah, and that's right for them. That's what they should do. But for other purposes, and one of the purposes is to make sure you understand that realism as a metaphysical thesis has nothing to do with science and actually is meaningless. Because for that purpose, you want to introduce this constructional language. So that's a kind of correction of science, but not for science's own purposes, but a correction of science for a different purpose. By the way, when he says it's practical and justifiable, so practical is kind of a bad translation there, actually. This is an S set, right? The word in German that's being translated as practical is Zweckmäßig. Zweck means goal or end, right? Like when Kant talks about an end in itself, that's Zweck. And this means like conformable to or something like that, right? It's from measure, the verb to measure. Zweckmäßig means conformable to an end. It's usually translated as convenient, right? So that's convenient is a good translation, although it doesn't show what philosophical sounding concepts are involved here, right? But at least it's a good translation of the word. Practical is just kind of loose. Right? So in particular, when you realize that this spec is in here, Carnap is saying, for the end of science, the realistic language is good. But for our end here in this book, a different language is good. And then I guess this is the right order to talk about these in, because from the fact that this is a rational reconstruction of how we actually recognize things, namely that it's a way of saying how in principle we could tell, not in the intuitive way we normally do, but using a definite list of indicators. So the fact that in principle we could do that, we know that what we ordinarily say is responsible to empirical evidence, and in that way is rational. But, and this is also something I emphasized in the last 3 lectures, so I hope it's not a surprise now, that that in principle is like only in principle, right? Again, in real life, we couldn't possibly, and I mean, again, I think Carnap recognized how that this was difficult. I don't think he recognized how very difficult it would be to actually explain how we tell when something is a table by looking at it. But even Carnap knows that it would be very, very complicated. I mean, maybe sometimes I think he thinks that this system is actually going to be filled out with constructive definitions, even though I think that would be totally impossible. But I'm not sure that he isn't more optimistic than I would be about that. But even if it would be possible, it wouldn't be possible to use those, right? It wouldn't be possible to go around, right? Like probably the constructive definition of table would be like a book. Yeah, you could like just every time you look at something, like read through this whole definition in order to decide whether it was a table, even if you remembered all your experiences and so on and so forth, right? So and again, this would work in principle only if you knew all the experiences you were ever going to have. So, I mean, that's, that never happens. So, so therefore, the fact that you can actually eliminate the higher level terms and end up with statements just about the basis is not really as important as you might think. Because in practice, the way what we say is responsible to the empirical evidence is not really by actually carrying out this eliminative process, but just by knowing at each level how we can collect evidence for and against our claim at the higher level. Right? So like we know procedures you can go through to test whether this is a table. The first thing is you look at it and you look at it, see, does it look like a table? But then, you look at it from this side, this, after a while you become more certain that it's a table, but you're never completely certain that it's a table. Or you shouldn't ever be maybe completely certain that it's a table. I mean, it's not clear which. What is going on? Anyway, yeah, they're complaining about them, right? This is like, what the hell is this? Well, and similarly, if you're given a heavy yellow piece of something, how can you tell if it's really gold? Well, try dissolving it in this, try doing that. But you can never be 100% certain. And so you can never be 100% certain means you can't translate the statement, this is a piece of gold, into some finite description of experiences. even in principle. But there's not really that much difference between uh, being able to do it in principle, but not really ever, and not being able to do it in principle. In the end, the situation is the same, that you know how to rationally and responsibly deal with statements like this is gold, right? You're not just uh, saying whatever you think will sound good, whatever you think will look good on TV or something like that. You're like, if you're challenged, you're able to produce your evidence. That's what's really important to Carnap, I think. Okay, so that's why I say that even though it looks like it sometimes, this is not the point of the book. Are there questions about this so far? There haven't been a lot of questions so far today. Yes.
Um, so I'm just trying to clarify, so far you just said clearing the way to put forward what you actually think.
Yeah. Okay. No, I mean, not just randomly, right? But because it really can feel like this is what the book is about. So, and in a way, Quine is going to interpret the book as being about this. Not exactly, but Quine is going to come much closer to this and ignore most of what I'm about to talk about. Not because Quine is stupid, but for other reasons that I'll try to explain when we get to Quine. Okay, so let me start instead with this question. What's wrong with metaphysics? Because I guess I erased this, but on this way of understanding it, you could see that like trying to exclude metaphysics from science. Now, I mean, many times in the book, it sounds like Carnap is taking questions that you might think you could ask in science and saying, those aren't the business of science, they're the business of metaphysics. So metaphysicians should ask them, right? Like the kind of thing that Aristotle very often does. Not with the term metaphysics, because that didn't exist yet, but with other terms like that. Right, like I think Aristotle says that about in the physics, he mentions the opinions of those who say that there is no such thing as motion, right? Like the Eleatics, basically, Parmenides and whatever, right? They maintained that motion is impossible and the whole world is a solid, motionless sphere. So, so Carnap, Aristotle says, this isn't really a question to discuss in the physics. Physics presupposes that there's motion because physics is the science of things that move and have a certain kind of principle of motion and rest. This is a question for first philosophy, right? So you might think Carnap is doing something like that, but I think especially when you get to the end of the book, it becomes clear that when you say that a question is belongs to metaphysics, you mean it's meaningless as a question. It's not really a question. Or it's not really a question in the sense that a question is a statement plus a task of determining whether that statement is true or false. Yeah.
Say this about all metaphysical questions.
Well, it's kind of his definition of metaphysical questions, I think, right? So yes, he does say that it's about all metaphysical questions, but it's more the other way around. He calls all questions like this metaphysical and none of the others. Right? He actually has a discussion of that in section, I don't know, one of these later sections. He discusses whether the term metaphysics could be used for at least in part to refer to part of science. Right? And he says, Well, people use it that way, but it's inadvisable because, it's so associated with other types of question, right? So he says like, if you want to talk, if you want it to mean the study of the most fundamental large scale facts about the world, call it cosmology, not metaphysics. If you want it to be X, Y, and Z, call it something else. Um, so yeah, so basically his proposal. Right? So he's always proposing a language for us to speak. That's what Carnap is always doing in one way or another. His proposal is that we use metaphysics specifically for this type of pseudo question and pseudo answer. Right? So it's something that looks like a question. It has a question mark at the end, right? It has the words in the right order in our language to be a question, but it doesn't actually assign a task that you would undertake in order to answer it. So at least for cognitive or theoretical purposes, it's not a question at all. Um, so again, if you thought the point of the book was to police science by reducing everything eliminatively to my basic experiences, then you would understand that we don't like metaphysics because metaphysics is the stuff that can't be reduced to my basic experiences, and therefore it's not about the things there really are, and therefore it's meaningless or useless or something. Right? Like, so if you imagine that we have this whole like way of talking about Zeus, and we take all the parts that can be defined in terms of what the weather is doing. And by the way, in ancient Greek, if you wanted to ask what the weather is like, you said, "What is Zeus doing?" That's actually the way you know. So like you want to take all the parts of to talk about Zeus that are versions of that answers to that question. What is Zeus doing? Zeus is raining, Zeus is blowing the waves ashore and doing all this stuff. Um, and anything else that's left that we say about Zeus, we're going to say that's metaphysics. That would be on the way I was talking about understanding the book. But the problem is that, since you can't understand the book that way, when you actually come, you find people saying all this stuff about Zeus, and your task is to reduce it all, to put it all into your constructional system. Um, um, so then why is anything left out? So that's why I said, what's so bad about metaphysics? Um, well, maybe that's not exactly the right way to get to the question, what's wrong with metaphysics, though? Okay, I mean, it is the way to get to it, but I should add one other thing, which I've already said before, namely, so what actually happens is that you come to some people who are talking about Zeus, and they say, Zeus is raining. And you say, oh, how can I tell Zeus is raining? And they say, well, stick your hand out the window and you'll feel raindrops, right? And then they say, um, um, uh, Zeus is the source of the universal law, right? This is something like the Stoics might say, right? And I say, oh, how can I tell that Zeus is the source of the universal law? Like, what observation should I make? And they say, no, no, you can't tell this by observations. Right? It's not that kind of thing. So at that point, you say, okay, everyday weather talk about Zeus. That's science. Stoic talk about Zeus as the principle of law in the cosmos or whatever, that's metaphysics. Because the Stoics themselves have told you that they don't intend it to be reducible to anything about experience. I mean, whether the Stoics themselves would actually say that about Zeus, I mean, that's not my point here. Stoics maybe would agree with Carnap about this. I'm not sure, but in any case, it's just an example. You imagine these people saying, and then what about mythology? And so Carnap says mythology is kind of like a borderline between science and poetry or something like that. Like it might be hard to tease out to what extent people actually um, intend what they're saying there to be verifiable. In which case, we're probably going to say it's false, right? Because we don't really believe that Zeus lives up on Olympus. And I mean, some people, I guess, probably still do, but most people don't. Right. So, and what part of it we're going to say is metaphysics, which means it's neither true nor false. It's like poetry, like lyric poetry. Actually, Carnap always adds, because I guess he thinks epic poetry is supposed to be frivolous. All right. Um, so if we accept that that's what metaphysics is an area of discourse that doesn't hold itself responsible to empirical verification. That rejects that demand. What's wrong with that? Why not have that? I mean, you can't verify it, but oh well. um, so, I mean, what's wrong with it is not just that it's not science, right? I mean, that it's not science as Carnap understands the term science. Now, how did he decide what to call science? Well, I mean, on one level, again, it's just his proposal, right? He discusses that actually in the same area where he discusses possible meanings of metaphysics, like what should be included in this term? Yeah.
Maybe this is slightly unrelated, but I have a question about Carnap's view on science and things that are like not verifiable. So what would he think about, like, for example, in astrophysics, they have dark matter, which is not something that is, as far as I'm aware, is not really proved, but it explains a lot of phenomena that we do see by our experience. It's like blood. But like, what would he consider that a form of metaphysics? Because dark matter apparently is not really like verifiable through independent physics.
Well, I mean, so dark matter is okay. So like, if you look at the disk of a galaxy, and you can see how fast.
Yeah,
you don't actually see them move, right? But you see it at this point by the redshift, right? You can see how fast stars are moving around the galaxy at each radius. And then like that should be related in a fairly straightforward way to how much mass there is inside this orbit. And then you can try to estimate how much all the mass inside that orbit you could see, how much would that add up to? And you say, oh, wow, there's not enough. And then you add also other stuff that you can't see, but that you know what it's like dust and gas and whatever. It's still not enough. And dark matter just means whatever else is in here that's making, right. So now, so in the Aufbau period, Carnap would say that you can reduce the statement, there's dark matter inside this disk, to some statement about the orbits, and then you can reduce that to some statement about your experience, and so on and so forth, right? in the later periods, especially like in the much later period that we're not going to get to this year, but he's going to limit it to saying that, look, the dark matter theory has observational consequences in some cases, right? And that's enough to make it an empirical theory, even though you may not be able to tell. I mean, for example, maybe it's not really mass inside here. Maybe the law of gravitation is not exactly what you think it is, or whatever, right? So, I mean, um, um, but yeah, does that answer your question? Right. So, I mean, and as I said to begin with, that's like part of the, not exactly the, I don't think this is the point of the book, but part of one of the problems that Carnap wants to show are really the same problem, is how does science have the right to talk about unobservables? And unobservable could mean dark matter, or it could mean the other side of that table, right? Depending on how you, yeah. Oh, it looks like I'm out of focus. Oops, it's not good. And there's only one way to restore focus. I wonder if that was also something they discovered when they worked on the earliest computers, that the only way to fix it was to turn it off and turn it back on again. What's going on here? Oh, there we go. All right. Right. So, and what I was going to say is, right. So, I mean, Carnap uses science for the realm of rationally reconstructible discourse. I mean, it's just, in a sense, has the status of a proposal, I think, in Carnap's mind. But just like the proposal for metaphysics and everything else, it's a proposal that's convenient for certain ends. And in particular, like, this is what I emphasized at the beginning of the course, there's this thing that's really successful. We want to call that and everything like that science. And it's not like traditional philosophy. But so the fact that metaphysics is not science, though, doesn't explain why metaphysics is a problem. I mean, Carnap actually addresses this in section 183 on rationalism. Right, the title of section 183 is Rationalism with a question mark. And, he says, is my position here, can it be described as rationalism? And he says, well, it's not rationalism as opposed to empiricism. It's not rationalism in that sense. That's obvious, right? But he says, the question is it rationalism as opposed to irrationalism? Is it saying that like everything in life should be ordered rationally? And I think, I mean, if there's anyone you could suspect of thinking that, it would be Carnap, actually. I mean, it wasn't, you could just tell from the way he wrote, but also he was a big proponent of Esperanto. Right? He thought, what? Yeah, he thought it would be great if we could all have this, synthetic language that was constructed to be accessible to everyone, and we'll all learn to speak it and whatever. But in that section 183, he says, no, rational search for knowledge and whatever is only a small part of life. There's all kinds of other parts of life, and the problem of life as a whole, like how to live it, correctly, I guess, right? The problem of life as a whole, science can help solve it. It's important, but it certainly is, even if science were complete, we had a complete list of, as he says, the purpose of science is to make a list of true statements. And then he adds, not all true statements. Like you might have thought that was the purpose, like a list of every true statement. So there's a certain selection according to principles I can't get into here because he doesn't know what they are. That's why he can't get into them here, right? But in any case, if you had a list of all true, interesting statements, that wouldn't get you very far in solving the problem of life, he says. Right? So there are lots of things other than science that are not just kind of nice, right? Like if you say, well, in addition to science, there's poetry. You might think that meant something like, well, there's serious work, that's science. And then when you need to relax, there's poetry. But no, Carnap is saying these other things that are not rational are, and not rational, they're not irrational in the sense that they're like, like crazed, right? Like on the loose, you know, that they're irrational in the sense that they're not concerned with what's true and false. That's not the point of them, right? So reason, at least theoretical reason, as you might say, has no application to them. So, but Carnap is saying they're essential. You can't solve the problem of life without these other things. So what's wrong with metaphysics then? And I think the answer is when Carnap gives, I think, his most careful definition of metaphysics in this book, possibly his most careful definition ever. This is section 176 on page 284. Metaphysics is the extra scientific domain of theoretical form. So metaphysics is of theoretical form. Now the word theoretical here, Carnap is using it. It's, you know, like later Carnap, there's a lot of stuff about theory versus observations. That's one use of the term theoretical, which actually is ancient. I found Galen using the term that way also, but whatever. But that's not the sense of theoretical Carnap is using here. This is theoretical as opposed to practical. So, and in that sense, it goes back to Aristotle, and it's emphasized by Kant, like reinvigorated by Kant, maybe you say. So, like a theoretical question is a question about what's true and what's false. A practical question is a question about what should I do? So ultimately, at least according to Aristotle or Kant, practical questions are ethical questions. Ultimately, because I mean, you know, in any given situation, I'm always asking, what should I do in order to get so and so? Or I'm usually asking that, right? So like, you know, should I drink the liquid that's in this cup? Now, I mean, so then first of all, we need a theoretical investigation to tell us what is the liquid that's in that cup. Like maybe it's water, maybe it's hemlock, right? But once I answer the theoretical question, I still have the practical question, right? Like suppose I say it's hemlock, right? So if you want to stay alive, you shouldn't drink it. So far that's right. That's what Kant would call a hypothetical imperative. Given that my goal is to stay alive, I shouldn't drink it. But if I'm Socrates, maybe my goal isn't to stay alive. So maybe I should drink it. Right? So that's why I say ultimately practical questions are ethical questions. At least, again, that's the way Aristotle and Kant think about it. The people we call pragmatists were people who said, no, it's just like hypothetical imperatives all the way down, basically. And the question is, which is Carnap? So I I tend to place him with Kant, but it's not easy. But so in any case, that so far was just to tell you what theoretical means here. It's an extra scientific domain of theoretical form. That means it's not science, but it expresses itself in questions and answers to the questions that are supposed to be inconsistent with each other, right? So that, like, if I ask, does this chalk really exist? And one person says yes, and the other person says no, it's merely a figment of your mind, they disagree with each other, right? They should be arguing with each other. That's metaphysics. But it's extra scientific. Why is it extra scientific? Well, I mean, this is the thing Carnap tries to address with his Trojan War example. Or, I mean, it's Trojan War versus another thing example, right? So he says there's an empirical concept of reality. And I didn't assign this section, but he describes how you can actually construct the empirical concept of reality. Or at least you can do it for objects of each type. Right? So like you can say, in terms of my experiences, what the difference between a real table and a hallucinated table is. Or a real table and a merely imagined table or whatever. Right? Like there are indicators. We have a way of using these words, right? Like dream and hallucination and whatever. Like we have ways of checking. So Carnap says, yeah, you can construct the concept of reality in that sense. And when you ask, like, did the Trojan War really happen? Or is it just a story? I mean, there's going to be a problem with this is going to be in the definition of Trojan War. Like, how much does it actually have to be like Trojan? But never mind that, right? So, did the Trojan War really happen? Carnap says this is an empirical question. Of course, we don't answer it by doing experiments, but we answer it by collecting evidence. And so if I say the Trojan War really happened and you say, no, it's just a story, like we should be able to explain what evidence tends in one direction and what evidence tends in the other direction. But then we have another question, like, forget exactly how Carnap phrases this in context, but like, do sensible bodies really exist? You want to kind of emphasize the really or capitalize it or something. Although one thing you should remember is, I mean, not just for this purpose, but always remember is that in German, all nouns are capitalized and nothing else. So whenever you see in a translation from German capitalized whatever, that's, that doesn't reflect the original. Anyway, so do sensible bodies really exist? And you can see that if you start asking for empirical evidence one way or the other, it's going to be fruitless. The whole point of this question is that it's fruitless, right? Like, if do sensible bodies really exist meant something like are they really solid or do they have holes in them? That's the question that sometimes people have expressed by saying this. Do sensible bodies really exist? Or are they mostly vacuum? That's an empirical question. Fine, we understand that. But that's not what this question means. Right? The question isn't whether they're solid or not. The question is whether they're actually out there or not, or are they just in my mind? So, and the whole point of it is that I'm going to have exactly the same experiences whether they really exist or not. But that's, again, it's not something that like we're detecting in the metaphysician. The whole point of this question is supposed to be that the metaphysician is supposed to agree. Yeah, I mean, in fact, that's supposed to be the idealist's strongest argument. You could have exactly these experiences, even though there was nothing out there. Why not? There's no logical connection, right? So, but that just goes to show that neither the idealist nor their opponent can possibly have empirical evidence for their view. Anything you're going to produce as empirical evidence, right? I'm going to say, well, like Samuel Johnson is supposed to have said about Berkeley, I refute him thus, and right, right? Like, of course, Berkeley is going to say, yeah, well, after you did that, there was an idea of pain in your foot, and there was an idea of, right? I mean, that doesn't get to Berkeley's position at all. um, I probably spent too much time on that, but it's okay. So what we have to ask is, what's bad about saying things that are not part of science in a way that makes them sound like they are? And because, by the way, Carnap doesn't deny that this expresses something. It doesn't have a truth value, but I use it to express something. Remember what he said at the beginning about the expression relation versus the designation relation, right? I mean, this expresses something about what's going on in me just as much as when I smile or whatever. As basically everything I say expresses something about what's going on in me. Carnap says that what this is really supposed to express is an attitude or Haltung. Right, Haltung is a German word. Right, it's a German word. It's from halten, which means to hold. But it's actually about kind of like holding yourself. It's usually translated as attitude, although it has other translations also, depending on the context, right? Because it's like how you're holding yourself. So in particular, at the very beginning of the book, in the preface, when Carnap says, oh no, wait, he doesn't use the term halting there, does he? Oh, he does, only on the next page, right? So in the preface, he starts off by saying, like, here outside the framework of the theory, but actually what it says in German is here outside the framework of theory. So I think he means, like, in the preface, he's not necessarily doing this. Here outside the framework of theory, I'm going to give some hints about what the purpose of this book is. And when he starts to explain it in the middle of the next page, he says, that, you know, this is the Grundeinstellung, the basic orientation of a certain group of people, and that these people have been, you know, in close contact with scientists, and consequently they have taken the strict and responsible orientation. So now that translates Grundhaltung, fundamental attitude, of the scientific investigator as their guideline for philosophical work, while the attitude, Haltung, of the traditional philosopher is more like that of a poet. So outside the structure of theory, what we can express is certain Haltung. which is not something theoretical, right? I express something about my attitude towards life. So there's a good way of doing that and a bad way of doing it. I mean, the good way of doing it is poetry, basically, according to Carnap. Music and other things like that. I think that's why he's very hesitant. He says very little about it because he doesn't want to start doing this. But the bad way of doing it is metaphysics. So when I say this, I'm expressing something about my haltung towards physical objects. Who knows what it is exactly? But it's a kind of emotional, practical relationship to physical objects. Again, practical, not just in the sense of pragmatic, but somehow like about their ethical significance. Like, for example, maybe what I'm expressing is that certain physical objects are bodies of rational beings, and they can't be treated in certain ways. That is, they shouldn't. So I think I can express that in terms of metaphysics. I think I can say, well, in addition to physical bodies, there are immaterial souls, and they're not identical to brains, and they're related in this way and that way, and that's why you should treat certain bodies a certain way. But Carnap says that wasn't the right way to express it. So why isn't that the right way to express it? Do people understand what I'm saying so far? I know I'm going kind of quickly through stuff. But you know, if you turn towards the end of the book, this thing about Haltung, so there's a section called Knowledge and Faith, section 181. Knowledge and faith translates Glauben und Wissen. So like Glauben, I think I mentioned towards the very beginning, can mean either belief or this is the infinitive of the verb. It uses a noun. So, but anyway, it can mean either belief or faith. And Wissen means knowledge, or it's one of the words for knowledge. So, but these aren't just random words, actually. This is, these words are from Kant's famous slogan, I had to eliminate knowledge to make room for faith. Right? That's what Kant said, like, I have to limit the theoretical realm because otherwise it's going to contradict the practical realm. That's basically what it meant for Kant. And in that section, Carnap says that that if by faith you mean like believing something you don't know why, that would basically be a form of intuition, which is okay, but it's subject to rational reconstruction. Right? I mean, you have to be able to, it has to be answerable to evidence in the end, no matter how you came to believe it. But, and maybe there would be better translated as belief than faith, right? Although that's what Locke means by faith. But anyway, but if by faith you mean the expression of an inner Haltung attitude, then it's something completely different from knowledge. It's not an alternate way of getting knowledge. It's not theoretical at all. It's practical. So like this makes us think about Kant. Why did Kant want to do this? Like why did Kant want to limit the realm of, and I know not everyone in this course necessarily has a background in Kant, but you if you haven't heard this about Kant, at least you should, right? That Kant's whole project was to delineate the limits of human, possible human knowledge. That was the theoretical part of his system. And then, you know, because what was left over somehow would become room for ethical, practical knowledge. So, I mean, so when Kant explains why this is so important, he says two things about it, I think. One is emphasized more in the first edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, and one in the more in the second. But so one thing he says is that by science, by getting beyond its bounds, has gone into realms where there's no way of solving, of like adjudicating disputes, and therefore it ends up in an endless dispute that can never be solved. And the examples of disputes are like pretty similar to the ones that Carnap is discussing in the end of this book. Like problems about free will, about dualism, about, right? Like about the existence of God too. I don't know if Carnap is really, it's hard to say what Carnap thinks about that. I mean, I know what Carnap's grandfather thought about that. Right, who Carnap might have learned some of this from. But in any case, Carnap's maternal grandfather was a theologian of sorts. Anyway, I mean, not just of sorts, he was published author or whatever. So that certainly, that thing about disputes is something that certainly worries Carnap too. Right? If we allow, so again, he always emphasizes that metaphysicians are going to argue with each other about this, but there'll be no way to settle it. So they'll always be arguing. And you might think, well, okay, that's a waste of time, but if that's what they want to do. But I think he thinks, as I believe Kant thinks too, that metaphysical disputes will tend to spill over into religion. And that, from that point on, people are going to start fighting wars about them. So I think that, that kind of, that worry in itself is pretty serious. But Kant has, I think he has a deeper worry about this, which is that once something with the form of science gets outside of its proper realm, it's going to start proving that ethics is impossible. For example, it's going to take the law of cause and effect, which says that, everything that happens in the world must be determined to happen that way by some previous event. And it's going to somehow apply that to outside the realm of the phenomenal world to say that any ethical principle must be the person who adopted it must have adopted it because they were forced to, sort of. Right? In other words, it's like I'm trying to phrase it in a somewhat more sensible way, but it's the old worry about determinism undermining ethics. And, Kant explains why if you let science outside, it's basically what I just said, something about cause and effect. But I think he thinks there's other problems like that. So this other one, well, I mean, that's also, I think, is going on in Carnap. Because again, the type of metaphysical problems he's trying to get rid of are precisely things like, what is the essence of the relation of cause and effect? Right? Like what actually forces the effect to happen? That's the exact same thing that Hume discusses when he discusses free will. Right? Like Hume actually says, you may think that my theory denies the existence of free will because I say that things that I do follow from my previous state in the same way that, a ball rolling in this direction follows from what it was hit by. But Hume says, actually, I don't think there's any necessary connection in either case. It's the other way around. So, I mean, now Carnap isn't saying that either, right? That also would be metaphysical from Carnap's point of view. But I think he's trying to get at something like that. Like if you think that the law of cause and effect forces you to choose, well, for example, to choose a certain language form, you're kind of mixed up. The law of cause and effect is a correlation. that you choose to represent in your language and this, that, and the other way. That's what it is. Um, the question of whether I'm free to choose a language form is, I mean, even that would be a bad way to put it. Although he does put it that way sometimes. He succumbs to the temptation, I think, I would say. That, you know, that's a practical question. It's not a theoretical question. Okay, and I'm out of time, but I think I'll add one more thing, which is that, so I think Carnap agrees, the question, what's really important in this book? What's really important in this book is explaining what responsibility is and why that's the appropriate attitude for theoretical questions, and using that to show what is left over for other questions, and why you would be wrong to interpret those as extra, like really hard to answer theoretical questions. That's the wrong way of understanding them. They're about overcoming life or something like that. That's a Nietzschean term that he's brought in here. So, but I'll just say one more thing, which is that, so I think Carnap is basically agreeing with Kant here, but he's more radical than Kant, because Kant said, well, yeah, you can still think and talk outside the realm of experience. You just can't have objective knowledge there or something like that. Whereas Carnap is, and this is something he attributes to Wittgenstein, which is why towards the very end, he talks about the ethical haltung that speaks from Wittgenstein's book, the Tractatus, right? So, and this is, I think he's thinking about this passage in the preface, which I tried to quote from memory before and I didn't do well, but here's the actual passage. This is Wittgenstein in the preface of the Tractatus. The book will therefore draw a limit to thought, or rather, not to thought, but to the expression of thoughts. For in order to draw a limit to thought, we should have to be able to think both sides of the limit. We should therefore have to be able to think what cannot be thought. The limit will therefore be able to be drawn only in language, and what lies beyond the limit will simply be nonsense. Right? So I think that's Carnap understands the Haltung that's speaking from within Wittgenstein's work is exactly what he's trying to do here. Exclude metaphysics by drawing a line with not within thought, but within language. Okay, I'll see you actually. So the next class is the last one that's going to be Zoom only on Monday morning. And then from then I'll be a regular schedule. And I'll see you then, I hope. Bye.